How are you, Laura?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for joining us today. And before we get started, I want to give you just a few moments to just share a little bit about yourself and maybe introduce your topic, and we'll go from there. How's that?
That sounds great. Let's see. Well, I became a follower of Jesus when I was 21 years old, my senior year at university, and it radically changed my life very quickly in a short span of time, and completely turned my worldview upside down. And I have just been on fire for the Lord ever since, and for sharing the reasons for the hope that I have with others. I never really intended to get involved in ministry to Muslims or to have any sort of focus on Islam, although that has ended up becoming kind of my specialty, I guess you would say, although I do speak on a lot of other topics as well. But over the course of time, what I thought was kind of one assignment at a time turned out to be about 15 years worth of ministry to Muslims and learning what Islam teaches, reading their sacred sources, having relationships with Muslims, sharing the truth with Muslims, meeting with imams, traveling to a whole bunch of Muslim majority countries. And so over time, of course, I have developed a compassion, love for Muslims, and certainly a compassion for Muslim women in particular, as I've seen and heard so many stories that are absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And as I've come to know Muslim women well, as if they're family. So so this month I'm going to be speaking at a few different conferences on Islam, and so you and I had talked recently about whether we might address a topic on Islam this weekend. So
Yeah. But as you said, we're here and we're doing this kind of thing because we have a heart for Muslims, and we love Muslims, and we want to see them come to the Lord Jesus Christ. We want to see them, embrace the real gospel. And so that's the whole reason that we do this. And of course, in doing so, we encounter a lot of objections, you could say. And let's talk about some of those that we've heard from Muslims at different times. And one in particular, I think that you're going to discuss today, is the fact that they like to say that Christianity just isn't worth considering or following, but because it's immoral. What are some specific behaviors that Muslims might give in support of this claim?
Well, Muslims look at things like the attire of Western women, what they're wearing, how they're speaking, how they're behaving, and what they see on TV, what they see on social media, as far as sexual conduct. Of course, that would be concerning to just about anyone who is a Muslim or a Christian. And so I really think that is that's the main source of this objection. Like you said, that Christianity just can't be true. It can't be good. It's not worth considering. I certainly would never become a Christian myself because, according to them, of the immorality in Christian women's attire, speech, sexual conduct, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm just thinking they when Christian apologists talk about the violence in Islam, we're constantly told not to not to place all Muslims in this one category, and I think we need to be careful of doing that. Not all Muslims are violent necessarily, but then they turn around and they a lot of times very easily look at us in that broad way. And I'm constantly trying to have some kind of meaningful conversation with a Muslim, And they bring up objections like this, and a lot of their objections are, we want to engage them conversationally, and we want to deal with, the issues that they're dealing with, but they're really not relevant to, to what Christianity actually teaches, as you're going to share here in a moment. So it's difficult. But tell us, when did you first hear this, and where do you think these objections come from?
Actually, I first heard this objection myself from a Muslim friend when I was visiting some Muslims who I had met in Afghanistan when I was there several years ago. A family I became close to while I was in Afghanistan ended up getting U.S. citizenship. They live in the U.S. now, and I went and visited them, stayed with them a week, and we had been doing all sorts of tourist type things during the days, which was a lot of fun. But this one evening, we were all exhausted. We just wanted to stay home, stay in the house, stay in the apartment, and just chill. And so they asked if I wanted to watch a movie. And because I think they were talking about, well, we don't want her to be bored. What should we do? Well, Americans like movies, don't they? Okay, you want to watch a movie? And so I told them, I said, well, I'm okay with watching a movie. I don't watch a lot of movies myself, but if that's what you guys want to do, that's great. As long as there's no, sex or obscenity or excessive violence or that sort of thing. I really can't stand watching that. And my friend said, really? That's really surprising. That's really interesting. And then she turned to her family. She's like, did you guys hear that? Did you hear what she said? She doesn't watch sex on TV. Yeah, I don't. So it turns out that my Muslim friends believed that Christians love spending our evenings watching sex and vulgarity on TV. That's what we do. And I have since come to understand that a lot of Muslims believe this. And not only do they believe that we like to watch these sorts of things, but they also believe, and again, when I say they, I don't mean all Muslims, but I mean right. A lot of Muslims I've talked to and heard from believe that we not only watch those activities, but we also engage in them ourselves. When we're not watching sex on TV, we are sleeping with, a bunch of different men, things like that. Right. So of course, this does not reflect Christianity or the lives of committed followers of Jesus. But I think it's important to discuss how we can respond, how we can be prepared to give the reasons for the hope that we have, as Peter said, so that we're not just caught off guard and go, what are you talking about? What are you, crazy? Yeah. So yeah, I'd love to talk about that.
That's good. I think there's a lesson for us here as well, that, we shouldn't allow the secular media to define Islam for us. Mm-hmm. And there's so many things that breaks down conversations between Christians and Muslims, mm-hmm. and you just really just demonstrated that it's so important for us to first of all not assume anything, mm-hmm. To learn to listen to what our Muslim friends are saying, but I think it's also important for us to make the distinction between Islam and Christianity. I say this a lot, and it's such a simple little thing, but we can attack or we can confront the teachings of Islam, but we shouldn't assume that our Muslim friend is like this, or they believe this particular thing.
That's such an important point, because what the Islamic sacred sources, their scriptures teach, is actually quite terrifying and disturbing. But I have interacted with, I've had so many Muslim friends who are equally horrified by those behaviors and left their country to escape that. So
yeah, I think it's the book, The Wind in the House of Islam. He talks about how a lot of Muslims witnessed what ISIS was actually carrying out. They were actually following what the Quran says, and a lot of the Muslim community was watching on in horror, and a lot of them come to Christ because they realized hey, this is not right. This,
Hmm.
this is conflicting maybe, with the moral law that's written on the heart. But
Hmm. Yeah,
tell
and
us.
I think that's a really important point as well, because I've heard so many Christians say, don't tell Muslims what their sources say. Don't point them to their sources. Don't even talk about that. Just tell them the good news of Christianity. And I actually think that that's a big mistake, because
Yeah,
they need to know what they are following, what they're supporting, even if they don't know they're supporting it. And so there's a way to present that information that is respectful and understanding, and not accusatory, but still could make all the difference for their decision, the most important decision they'll ever make.
yeah, absolutely. So you've shared a little bit there, but how might we respond when we encounter this objection that we started off with?
Yeah, well, one point I like to make, in all different types of conversations, discussions about this type of topic, is that we can't determine what is good or what is true based on social conventions. So much of what we like depends on what we're used to, right? It depends on what our family or our culture has taught us. And oftentimes, those are not reliable measures. I mean, every culture has different ideas about what is right and what is good, and they're not compatible with each other. So somebody's wrong. A lot of people are wrong. Every major worldview makes different and mutually exclusive claims about truth. So we can't really know what is true or what is good until we look at the evidence for who God is, and we pay attention to what God has revealed. Once we understand, who God is. If we just follow our heart, kind of like our Western culture tells us, like Disney tells us, and
Yeah,
just do, or do whatever we're used to, whatever others tell us, we will easily find ourselves just being tossed about by the latest trends with no foundation for knowing objective truth or goodness or beauty. I actually have an example I can give you if you're
okay,
interested. Uh,
absolutely.
so I actually grew up very close to the beach in Florida,
Mm,
and it was very normal as I was growing up to see women in short shorts, in tank tops, even bikinis, just kind of walking around the beach and the stores, shops nearby, and all of that. And I didn't object to it because that's all I had ever known. No one around me seemed to have a problem with it.
mm.
But then I moved to the mountains of Colorado. I lived there for a decade, and it's cold almost all year there, certainly by Florida standards, it is. And when I returned to the beach 10 years later for my 10-year anniversary trip celebration, I was shocked and disturbed, offended even by the
Yeah,
lack of clothing that women wore. I thought it was disgusting. I thought it was offensive. Of course, wearing skimpy clothing didn't just suddenly become bad or offensive during the 10 years I lived in the mountains. My perspective changed because of what I had become accustomed to. And similarly, a Muslim who's grown up seeing women almost completely covered will likely be shocked and offended when she sees women wearing Western clothing.
yeah,
Again, this just doesn't tell us anything about what is truly good. And I'm not saying that there is no right or wrong about attire.
sure.
I think we'll talk a little later about. I'll mention that I do think, there is problematic dress clothing, but the point is that we have to look to God to tell us what is good. We have to look to the evidence to know who God is.
Great point. I have never thought of that, or at least thought very deeply about that contrast. And
Hmm.
as you were talking, I was just thinking about, not just Muslim women, but Muslim guys, and the
Hmm.
shock that they
Hmm.
must experience. But
Right,
so
right.
what kind of evidence should people be examining to, you shared a little bit there, but what do we need to be looking for to discover what is true? A lot of Muslims like to start with the Quran. They make that assumption. So
Mhm.
what kind of evidence should we be giving them?
Well, it's important to look at the historical reliability of the Quran versus the historical reliability of the Torah, the Psalms, the prophets, the Gospels. So, for example, are they internally consistent? Are they consistent, within themselves and with one another? Are they supported by external sources, things like archaeology, historical documents, eyewitness testimony that's been recorded? Is there a chain of custody leading back to the original event? That's something that J. Warner Wallace talks a lot about as a former cold case detective, the chain of custody. Another bit of evidence is the historical evidence for the claims made by each religion. So did Jesus claim to be God, or did he claim to be merely a prophet? What does the evidence show? Was Jesus crucified or was he not crucified? What does the evidence show? Did he rise from the dead? Did he not rise from the dead? We can also look at the reliability of the messengers. So who are these messages, these recorded documents coming from? Were they at the events they claim to record? Or did they have access to eyewitnesses who were there? Did they have motives to lie? What kind of character and integrity did they have? What did people who interacted with them say about them? And, another piece of evidence, another line of reasoning is the ability of the worldview to explain reality. I think that's a big one that I've been realizing more and more as I've looked at studies on different areas of life with regard to sexuality and economics and crime and things like that. Which worldview best explains reality, best fits with the world in which we live? So in all of these areas and more, the evidence, I believe, of course, is solidly on the side of Christianity. And I have a lot of other talks that I give on those topics. But those are just a few of the types of evidence that we need to be looking at to evaluate which worldview is accurate.
Excellent. I love to talk about the the evidence for the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And as you were talking,
Yes.
I'm thinking about passages such as 1 Corinthians 15 and Philippians 2 that contain these early oral creeds, and
Yes.
the evidence is just really overwhelmingly in our favor. And so I think it's just everything that you just said is just so important that Christians are prepared to respond with this kind of evidence.
Yes.
And give it to our Muslim friends. And even though they want to begin with the Quran and assume it's true, I think we still should present this evidence. And I just think it just opens the door wide open for the Holy Spirit to work.
Absolutely. And we see that we see the use of evidence from God throughout the Old Testament, from Jesus giving miracles to affirm that he has the authority to do and say what he's doing and saying. We see it from Peter and Paul, and we have commands to do likewise, especially 1 Peter 3:15. So I totally agree with you.
Absolutely. So it's a great point that, we can't just decide that a worldview is false because, it makes us uncomfortable or it doesn't fit with our social norms. And as you've just shared, you love to point people to the evidence of Christianity and help make this case for the truthfulness of the gospel, really. How else might we respond to the objection that Christianity isn't worth considering because of things like sexual immorality?
Yeah, well, we need to look at the Christian scriptures and see what Christianity actually teaches, because as we both mentioned earlier, this objection to Christianity from the place of, well, it's sexually immoral or whatever, it's Christian women are immoral. It just does not fit with what Christianity actually teaches. So I like to tell people, and if possible, to get them to look at the scriptures with me, though sometimes that can be a bigger challenge, and see what it says. And the fact is, the Christian scriptures teach that women are to dress modestly.
Yeah.
Our beauty is to come from our inward character, not from our outward appearance. We see that in verses like 1 Timothy 2. I think it's verses 9 and 10. It says, I want women to dress modestly with decency and propriety. We see that in 1 Peter 3. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, but from your inner self. And these passages, when you look them up, you'll see examples of what not to do, like braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes or things like that. And the point is not so much that these things are signs of immodesty, because I mean, in our culture today, wearing pearls is not a sign of immodesty. You're more likely to see pearls on a fully covered older woman than on someone who is trying to gain attention with their look, with their lack of clothing or that sort of thing. But the enduring principle here is to be modest. That may look a little different. It does look different in different cultures, but it's important that our dress communicate to others our heart, our intention. Although, as I said before, there are some things that are never modest. I don't wear bikinis anymore. I encourage my the young women I mentor not to as well. But we do see that Christianity calls for modesty. We can have discussions about what that means, but we are called to modesty. Sexual immorality has absolutely no place in Christianity. The Christian scriptures teach very clearly and repeatedly that sexual immorality is wrong. So we see that from Mark, who's recording the testimony of Peter. He talks about sexual immorality being evil. We see that from the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 6. We see that in Ephesians 5. Also from Paul. We see that from Jude, the brother of James and Jesus. We see that in John, from John, rather. And so it's really it's all throughout the scriptures, and in the Old Testament as well. Those are just examples from the New Testament. But it is the consistent command for Christians that there is no place for sexual immorality, for any type of sex other than one man and one woman in a committed marriage for life. And so we also see that the things like vulgar talk has no place in Christianity. Ephesians 4:29 says, don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs. Ephesians also talks about, let there be no obscenity, no foolish talk, no coarse joking, nothing that's out of place, but let thanksgiving come from your mouths. What we say is supposed to be worthy of respect, and we're to encourage people. We're not to be malicious in our speech. And so all of these different accusations, if Muslims have specific objections outside of those kind of three big areas of speech, attire, and sexuality, we could talk about that, but I would say let's go to the Christian scriptures and see what they actually teach, because this is based on a misunderstanding. Yeah,
and there's so many misunderstandings. The Quran consistently misrepresents biblical faith, especially in regard to the gospel.
Right.
Of course, this leads Muslims to believe that the Bible's been corrupted, even though that's not even supported by the Quran. So there's just so many misunderstandings. And again, I'm an evangelist. I want to share the gospel with them, and as you said, I want to show them what the Bible actually teaches. And I think everything that we're talking about here it's just so important that we're able to recognize these spiritual barriers, is what I call them. Dr. David Geisler has a great book called Conversational Evangelism. I don't know if you've read it, but
no, not yet.
Highly recommend it. He talks about the different spiritual barriers that people have, and he talks about, intellectual barriers, and I think that's what we're talking about here, today is they have misunderstood what Christianity teaches and what it stands for. And so they have this intellectual barrier, and we need to be able to recognize that when we're having these conversations with them. They may have an emotional barrier. Perhaps they've been, hurt by a Christian, or they've been offended in some way. So, all of these, or these two that I've mentioned, they require different responses from us, I think.
Right.
And of course, a lot of people, including Muslims, they just don't want to believe. They have a volitional barrier.
Right. And they have a lot to lose by leaving Islam.
True.
And so we need to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, great point.
And just to be clear, I mean, like family support, community jobs, status in the community, kind of a sense of security from people. So obviously, I still want to see them come to know the truth, because the benefits far outweigh the cost. We need to know the truth, seek it, find it, follow it. But yes, I think it's valuable to keep in mind, this is not just a matter of, hey, why don't you come to church on Sunday instead of the mosque on Friday? It's not what we're asking them to do.
Yeah, and I don't think a lot of Christians realize that. If one of my daughters left the faith and God forbid became a Muslim, she wouldn't be kicked out of my family. I wouldn't stop loving her. Right. I wouldn't stop pursuing her. But as you said, a lot of these Muslims, if they even, indicate they're the least little bit interested in Christianity, it can be very severe for them as far as their relationships go with their families. And definitely keep that in mind.
Absolutely.
Okay, so how can we help people to reconcile what is true about Christianity with what they see with their own eyes? In other words, how do we respond in a way that lets people know that the things that they see on TV and perhaps downtown are not necessarily Christian behaviors? Yeah,
well, there's not a lot of religious freedom in most Muslim majority countries, to put it mildly. And so if you live in a Muslim majority country, you're expected to follow Islam, end of discussion, for the most part. But in the US, we do have religious freedom. We have separation of church and state, and individuals are free to choose to follow whichever worldview they find the most compelling. And so as a result, it is not a good assumption at all for Muslims to assume that just because someone lives in the West, that they are a Christian. In the USA, about 64% of people claim to be Christians as of the latest reliable poll that I've been able to find from the past year. 64%. Okay, that's far from everybody you see. But even that number is very, very high when you consider that only about 3% or less have beliefs that line up with the Christian scriptures. So I believe it was last year, 2022, when Barna did their most recent worldview study, and they asked very basic questions about, do you believe that there is one God? Do you believe that the Bible is authoritative? Very just a few very basic questions, and they ask things like, do you also, do you think it's good to pray, to to do palm readings and things like that to get a better picture of your future? So when they asked those questions and looked at those answers, at most, it was about 3% of Americans who responded who had beliefs that lined up with the Christian scriptures. I suspect that if they were to ask more than the 5 or 6 questions they asked, that number would be even lower. So what we're talking about is a culture that is not living according to Christianity. It is very unusual to come across a genuine, committed follower of Jesus in the United States. And most other Western nations have similar or lower percentages. The majority of people who live in the West and claim to be Christians do not read the scriptures, do not study them, do not obey them. They call themselves Christians because it's part of their heritage and their culture, not because they even know what it teaches, much less follow it. And so I think that's an important point to raise with our Muslim friends as well. And I think that's something they really can relate to and understand, because the majority of Muslims as well do not know what their scriptures teach and do not follow them.
Yeah, I think this is just a great opportunity for us to do what we talked about earlier. This is a great opportunity for us to point them to what the Bible actually teaches. If they bring up some kind of objection that's just it's not what Christianity teaches, I try to point them to what I said earlier. You don't judge a belief system by how somebody misrepresents it.
Right.
And so just as you wouldn't want me to judge you by what Hamas or ISIS or whoever has done, don't judge me by what you see much of America doing. Let's go to the book and let's talk about what the Bible actually says. Let's look at the life of Jesus and look at what he taught. I think it's just I want to see it as an opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But how else might we respond? Anything else that you would add to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I like to take every opportunity to share the gospel, whether they're willing to look at the scriptures with me or not. And what I've seen is this tendency, I think, among people generally, to make a big deal of the sins that are not really problematic or acceptable in their culture, and to minimize the sins that are a big struggle for them or their culture, their community. And we certainly see this with sexual immorality, that Muslims in particular are taught that sexual immorality is this is just the factor that determines whether you're pure evil or not. And so I think it's important to share that we disobey God in many other ways. Sexual immorality is a big deal. It is serious. It is opposed to Christianity, but it is not the only way to disobey God. We disobey God when we honor or obey or elevate someone or something to be equal or above God. We disobey God when we prioritize our own desires over the needs of others. We disobey God when we lie, when we deceive people, when we cheat, when we steal. We disobey God in countless other ways. And so we have all failed to live up to God's perfect standards all the time. Jesus summarized the law with the commands to love God with your whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. If we have, and our neighbors include our enemies, all right? So if we haven't done those perfectly at all times, then we have failed to live up to his perfect standards. So that is the bad news, and I think we need to share that bad news, but then we need to tell them, but that's not the end of the story. That's not all there is to this.
Yeah. Really what you're talking about is the problem, the universal problem of sin. And, one of the greatest barriers that I think Muslims have is the fact that they have such a low view of sin. Allah can just forgive. And, I constantly talk about the fact that we have, sinned against an infinitely holy and righteous God, and therefore what we need is his righteousness. But let's talk a little bit more about the bad news or sin, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, a lot of Muslims are going to say, well, it's not so big a deal as long as your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds. As long as you have more good deeds, that's why you need to do some more good deeds, and especially on the more important behaviors, right? But I also like to point out that weighing good deeds versus bad deeds isn't just, and we have no reason to believe that God evaluates us that way. If God is just, then he can't ignore any disobedience, even earthly justice systems that are decent. Operate in such a way that it is not considered right or just for the authorities to just ignore violations of the law just because someone's done more good deeds than bad deeds. So, for example, if you get caught stealing, the police don't just, if they're doing their job, they don't just let you go free just because you pay for your items more often than you steal them, right? If you were to murder 15 people and get caught, the judge and the jury wouldn't just let you go and say, well, there were 1,000 other people he didn't kill. So that's not how justice works.
Yeah.
If you violate the law, there is a penalty to pay. And likewise, if you lie to me, 20% of the time, and then I realize this, and I understand that you are lying to me and deceiving me, I'm not going to say, well, as long as you keep, telling the truth about 80% of the time, we're good. Our friendship's good. You're trustworthy. That's just not the way any of this works. So think about how much more will a perfectly just, a perfectly holy and righteous God be committed to punishing every disobedience. God would not be just if he pretended like your bad deeds didn't happen just because you had other good deeds, more good deeds. That's not justice. It's not holiness. It's not righteousness. It's compromise. And God does not compromise when it comes to his character. He takes all disobedience seriously because it's inherent to his character. And I would point out as well that even Muhammad, the excellent pattern of conduct for Muslims, didn't know if he was going to paradise.
Right.
Although he supposedly lived such an excellent life, his deeds were not enough to assure him of salvation. And he got a lot of things wrong, but he got that right, that he was right to doubt his salvation because a holy God cannot overlook any violation, any penalty, any disobedience, any sin, although I know the word sin can be a bit of a barrier sometimes for Muslims. So I'll look for other words like disobedience or violation, that sort of thing.
Right.
So yeah, that's the bad news. That is the bad news, but there is good news as well, as you know, and I think it's important to raise that as well.
Absolutely. Go ahead and share that with us if you would like.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, well, because of Jesus, that's not the end of the story, right? Our disobedience doesn't have to define us. God has provided a way for us to be forgiven without compromising his justice. And I just think this is the coolest thing ever. God is fully just. He doesn't and can't ignore sin, but he is also the justifier. So in other words, he's the one who demands justice, but he's also the one who pays the justice. He makes a way for us that doesn't ignore evil, doesn't pretend that evil is okay or that violations, disobedience are okay. God has made a way for us to be with him in glory forever by offering to pay the penalty for our sin himself. And this is the good news. I think it's significant. I don't know why I don't hear this more often. And maybe you have some thoughts on this, but the word gospel means good news. And I've just explained the good news, which is laid out through the life and death and resurrection of Jesus and further explained throughout the epistles. What is the good news according to Islam? They acknowledge that there's a gospel.
Yeah.
What do they think is the good news? What do they think the gospel is? And especially, what is the good news for women according to Islam?
Good point.
So according to the one true God, it is very clear what the good news is. God the Son came to earth as a man, paid the penalty for our sin that's due to God the Father. It's the climax of God's work in the world that has been revealed through God and recorded by many different authors over a very long period of time, consistently and thoroughly.
Excellent. I've asked that very question to several imams. The Arabic Injil is derived from the Greek Evangelion. And I've asked them, just come point blank and say, well, what is the good news of Islam? What is the good news message in the Quran?
Right.
And I never thought about applying it to, that question to women in Islam. What a powerful way to emphasize the point that I was already making there.
Right.
But God made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in Christ, in him.
Amen.
And that's exactly what the gospel gives us, and that's why it's good news. Great points there you made, Laura. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to share, or anything else you keep in your tool belt to say to Muslims when they object?
Yeah, well, I do like to emphasize the point that Christianity is objectively good and beautiful for women, even beyond the most important good news that we just talked about, but including for this life. Unlike Islam, Christianity is good news, not only for men, but also for women. It's not only true, but it is far better for women than any other worldview. And so if we look at Christianity versus Islam on teachings about women, we see a stark contrast. So for example, in Christianity, women are created in the image of God. This causes this results in inherent value, dignity, and worth for women, and equal value as men have. And in Christianity, according to Christianity, husbands are to love their wives the way Christ loved the church. He must be willing to give his life for her. He needs to lead her spiritually in ways that make her beautiful and excellent in character, not in ways that leave her bitter or resentful or ignorant. He needs to love her the way he loves his own body. All of this is Ephesians 5. He needs to take care of her in every way that is good for her. He needs to prioritize her over his own parents. I know that's a huge source of bitterness and controversy and danger, even for Muslim women, that men prioritize their own mother over their wives. And but according to Christianity, men are to love self-sacrificially in such a way that women are happy to submit to their husband's leadership. Women are not told to submit to all men the way they are in Islam, but to their husband, who's responsible to God for loving her the way Christ loved the church. We also see in the scriptures that a husband's prayers can be hindered if he mistreats his wife. There's nothing equivalent to that in Islam, but Peter talks about that in 1 Peter 3:7. Galatians talks about how women and men alike are saved by grace through faith, and we receive the same glorious inheritance. There aren't two different rules. It's by grace through faith. We also see in Christianity that men are responsible for their own sins. They are to practice self-control. It's not a woman's responsibility to hide herself and cover herself to keep a depraved man from sinning, from violating her. The Spirit of God empowers men to be self-controlled, to be respectful of women, to be courteous and kind and protective, and to use their strength for good, not for evil. Men are to be faithful to their one wife. And I know that's the multiple wives thing has been another source of great trauma and pain and suffering for women in a lot of the Muslim world. So these are very different than what we see in Islam. And if we have time and you'd like, I could share just a few things about what Islam teaches as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't help but think about all the atrocities that's taken place in Israel, and I mean, we don't have to talk about that, but I think it would be good if you shared a little bit about what Islam does teach about women, because I think Christian women in our churches today, they need to hear this kind of stuff. They need to,
Yes.
We're constantly hearing things like, they believe in the same God that we do, and they're just another Abrahamic religion. They need to see some of these differences and understand that this is not coming from the same God. Maybe share a few of those with us.
Absolutely. So women, as well as men, are not made in the image of God, according to Islam. So there's no basis for inherent human worth or dignity or human rights. A person's value is dependent on things like their gender, their accomplishments, their perfect obedience to the law. And this is actually terrible for women because according to Muhammad, their prophet Muhammad, and just keep in mind, I mean, when I say prophet Muhammad, I'm talking about, false prophet Muhammad. But according to Muhammad, women are lacking in intellect, morality, and common sense. The Quran teaches that the witness of two women is equal to that of one man. And the hadith, Bukhari explains why. And it's because of the deficiency of her mind. And Sahih Muslim, another hadith that important teaching of the life and words of Muhammad, who is the excellent pattern of conduct, who is to be imitated in all things. It records that Muhammad said women lack common sense, they fail at religion, and that most of the inhabitants of hell are going to be women. They are women. He said he was able to see hellfire. He had never seen such a horrible sight, and most of the inhabitants there were women. All right. We also learn from Islam that the reason, according to the Quran, chapter 4, the reason men are in charge of women, and again, not a husband with authority over his wife and the responsibility to love her as Christ loved the church, but rather all men in charge of all women, because God made men superior to women. The Bible doesn't teach anything like that, any sort of superiority in value or anything like that. The Quran 4:34 says men are in charge of women because God made men superior to women. In Islam, men are encouraged to beat their wives if they even fear disobedience from them. So it would be bad enough if men were encouraged to beat their wives if the wives were actually disobedient. That would be terrible. But it's not even that good. Men are encouraged to beat their wives if they fear disobedience from them. So that means all you need is an insecure man in order to justify beating his wife. Aisha, Muhammad's child bride and favorite wife, used to talk about, she talked about how the Muslim women suffered more than all the other women, and the bruises all over their skin made them look greener than a green dress. This is obviously quite problematic. Men are permitted to marry multiple women according to the Quran, as I mentioned before. Men are permitted to have sex with children. Muhammad married a 6-year-old, consummated the marriage when she was 9, and continued that process of what we would call statutory rape until his death at, I believe, 53 years old, when she was only 18. She was 18 when he died. So throughout that entire time, he was having sex with a child, and he is the excellent pattern of conduct. I've seen this throughout Afghanistan as well. I met so many women who had been married off at 9 years old.
Wow.
And it's just absolutely horrifying.
Yeah.
men are, and this is probably the worst one, I think, or these, along with the child thing, and something we are seeing with in Israel, with Hamas in Israel, is that men are permitted, even encouraged, to capture women in war and to rape them. And
Yeah.
so we have seen, if you've been paying attention to the news, we have seen just nauseating images of women with their pants just soaked in blood in the back from being sodomized over and over, presumably by gangs of men who hate them, by the way, who hate them and think they are the most despicable creatures on earth, who think they have no value, because non-Muslims are called the worst of creatures. If you've ever met a Muslim and asked them how they feel about pigs, you pay attention to the horrifying response, how they look horrified. Well, Islam teaches that that Christians and Jews and polytheists are the worst of creatures. Yeah. And the only way, to interpret that is we're even more despicable, disgusting, and vile than the way they view pigs. And we see throughout the life of Muhammad and the teachings of the Quran and the commentaries on the Quran that women are sex objects in Islam. The Quran too talks about how women are a field to be plowed. The word used in most translation is your tilth. And so approach your tilth any way you want, anyhow, any way, whenever you feel like it, whatever you want. There's no mutual giving of one another, entrusting one another's bodies to your spouse.
Property. Yeah.
Yes, women are property, exactly. And Islam allows temporary marriage, which is practically speaking indistinguishable from prostitution. A man can hire a wife for the hour, for the day, for the week while he's traveling, so that he doesn't have to practice any self-control whatsoever. And this is a perfectly good practice within Islam. It's not just permissible, but it is considered good. Muhammad said to his followers, "This is a good thing that Allah has allowed. Do not forbid yourselves what Allah has given you that is good." So again, I think what we're seeing from Hamas does not come out of absolute nowhere. It does not necessarily come from a place of having been hurt or devalued or not raised by anyone, or any other things which Westerners might imagine that I've heard from them. This is more accurately the following of their sacred sources, the following of Islam according to its scriptures.
Wow. It's just so unfortunate that most people in the West are just totally unaware of this stuff. And it just opens the door wide open for all these, for lack of a better term, leftist politicians who go before the public and they lecture us about human rights and talk to us about what's morally right or wrong, and all the while supporting Islam and Hamas. And I just think I've always said, I wish every Christian woman in the American church knew what you just shared in the last few moments.
Yeah, so do I.
If we can't get men fired up and get them to lead, if women knew this, I think they would respond in a very positive way. And that's again, my heart is to see the church equipped in this area. And we're living in an age of deception, and we've got to respond to this kind of thing according to 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5. We're destroying these type of ideologies, and this is what spiritual warfare is all about. But I'll spare you the rest of that sermon.
I love it. Amen, brother.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. And as we close out, share with us how our viewers can get in contact with you, maybe, or find out more information about you, maybe
Sure.
share some of that.
Yeah, well, my website is called An Affair with Reason. So you can go to www.anaffairwithreason.com. And I write articles there about theology, worldview, apologetics, Islam, etc. You can also see some of the presentations I've given there on the multimedia page. I've given some online presentations at conferences and to Ratio Christi chapters at universities, things like that. YouTube channels that I've been able to share from my website.
Yeah.
There's a contact page, there's a speaking page, so that you can get in touch with me if you'd like me to speak at your church or your retreat or your whatever, your neighborhood. And let's see, I have actually prepared a 20-lesson course on Islam that is available at womeninapologetics.com. If you want to take a deep dive, I highly recommend that course, because I made references to a lot of passages from Islamic sources in this talk, but in that course, I actually put them on the screen. We made beautiful graphics to go along with the recorded teachings. And there are discussion questions. You could do it with your small group, that sort of thing. So 20 lessons, and each lesson is about 20 to 30 minutes of a video. And again, a couple of discussion questions. So at the time that we made that a few years ago, I didn't know of anything similar to that. I really still don't, I don't think.
Yeah.
Highly recommend that course. There's also a podcast that I'm a huge fan of called the Knight and Rose Show, KNIGHT and Rose Show. And there are episodes on Islam, probably every, 8 or 10 episodes, but that also includes episodes on Christianity, worldview, how our worldview impacts our view of policy making, of crime, of racial issues, all sorts of different issues. So, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm on Facebook, Laura Zeifer, Zifer Powell, and most of my posts are public. So feel free to follow me there.
Awesome. Well, I also highly recommend your Women in Apologetics Islam curriculum. I watched most of it, and of course follow the Knight and Rose podcast, and just appreciate all that you're doing, Laura. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. I want you to know that we're praying for you, and
thank you.
Just so appreciative of what you do, and we need more women like you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. And this topic is important. Like you said, every woman, man, and child, frankly, needs to know what, more about Islam, and women need to know what is taught on women. So Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. All right. Well, with that said, please like and share this video with your friends, and thank you for joining us, and until we meet again, have a great day.
Thank you. You too.